All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is the first of the UU Justice Ohio webinars on creating a beloved community. And I want to welcome you on the not quite as cold night as it has been. I'm Joan Van Beesler, and I'm the Executive Director for UU Justice Ohio. And tonight we're going to be looking at informed action, which is Unitarian Universalist approaches to social justice. And our guest presenter is the Rev Dr Susan Ritchie. She's minister of the North Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Lewis Center, Ohio. And she's the director of the UU House of Studies at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, which is just in Delaware, just a few miles north of Columbus, Ohio. And she's author of the book, Children of the Same God, which is Unitarianism in historical relationship to Judaism and Islam. And she has another book that's in the works here called Unitarian Pirates of the Caribbean, right?
That's it.
Historical Adventures in UU Polity. So we're really happy to have Susan here on our kickoff webinar, which is absolutely great. And I have a couple of other things to show you all, just to give you a little bit of update on UU Justice Ohio before we begin with Susan. Just to let you know, we are now on website, Facebook, and as of yesterday, Twitter. So if you tweet or listen to tweets or read tweets, take a little time and sign up for UU Justice Ohio. And our Facebook page is becoming quite active right now with all the stuff that we have going on this winter and this spring. So it's become a major source of knowledge for folk in Ohio. And then just to let you know that UU Justice Ohio is a fully cooperative member of the coordinating committee for the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival. And if you've not heard of this, then you might want to check out our Facebook page, or you could text MORAL to 90975 for updates, or check them out on their website, poorpeoplescampaign.org. So we have quite an active coordinating committee here in Ohio, and you are going to be seeing a lot of that in the weeks and months to come, and especially in May and June when we have 40 days of social justice actions, rallies, gatherings, marches, educational events, and civil disobedience planned. So it's going to make a huge mark in building beloved community here in Ohio. And just to let you know, our next webinar next month on February 14th, Valentine's Day, is going to be myself and going to be Samuel Prince, who is a member of the UU Justice Ohio Board. And we're going to be taking a look at how we renew our justice ministries. What does it mean in terms of mission and vision in our congregations? And how do we focus some of this energy so that we become more effective? So that's the advertising. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to let Susan begin her screen share and start us off. Susan?
Great. Yeah, I'm going to hold off on the screen share till we have something to look at, but just start our conversation here with all of us popped up. So hello, I'm delighted to be with you tonight. And look, we didn't even have to head out into the cold or the dark or anything. It's a miracle. Anyway, I'm here to talk about both the history and the theology of what informs our social action. So specifically what I wanted to do tonight was talk about two kind of broad strategies of social justice movements that have happened inside of both Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism, and then briefly outline three theologies that I see as being the main theological informers of what we do in social justice, and then finally a little bit about what's unique about us as Unitarian Universalists doing interfaith work, especially in social justice arenas. So that's kind of my agenda, but we're not a bazillion people. So if there's anything you were hoping we would talk about tonight that I didn't list, please feel free to pop that up into the chat box, and we will find a way to get to it, I promise. So I'd like to start with the two strategies. So it seems that historically there's really been, very broadly speaking, a slightly different approach to how Unitarians and how Universalists have done effective social action. So I want to look at two specific examples of really recent, really effective Unitarian Universalist social actions, and just talk about how they're a little bit differently informed in terms of how they present to the world and the theologies that they're based on. And then we'll look at those three theologies that I told you about. So I have two examples for you, both from some of our fabulous young Unitarian Universalist adults. One is example of Zach Walls, who is a UU young adult who addressed the Iowa State Legislature previous to legal marriage equality, and he gave the best talk to those legislatures about why they should approve marriage equality that you can imagine. And not only was it an excellent example, I think in many ways it kind of captures how Unitarian Universalists approached marriage equality in general, which in turn I think reflects a really long history of how Unitarians looked at social justice. And then I want to take a look at another really short video of another fabulous young adult UU. Elizabeth Mount is their name. And Elizabeth was a part of that amazing action that Greenpeace did in Portland, Oregon a number of years ago. I'm thinking it's about 4 or 5 years ago now. I don't know if any of y'all remember that, but it was just an absolutely breathtaking thing. What they did is they actually went down, they hung off the edge of the bridge in Portland, trapping the gas. I'm suddenly losing vocabularies because I'm an urban girl and I don't understand the difference between ships and boats and stuff. So like there was some kind of vessel that you put, that Exxon was using for oil, and they actually were able to keep it trapped inside the bay by hanging off the edge of the bridge. Does anybody remember this? I hope I'm not hallucinating it. Anyway, it was a really spectacular Greenpeace action. And, not only was it super effective and super brave, I mean, imagine that. So these folks hung off the edge of that bridge for, something like 24 hours. But they also had these beautiful streamers. So, I mean, it was just absolutely beautiful. But anyway, there was a lot about the way Elizabeth couched how they approached that action that really reminded me of Universalist strategies for social justice. So that's my background story. But let me queue up right now. So I'm going to go into the screen sharing. I'm going to queue up the first video, which is the Zach Walls that I told you about. And I'm just curious as you listen to this, now it's only about 3 minutes long, we don't have any long videos, curious about what kind of strategies you see him using to persuade the legislature.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Zach Walls. I'm a 6th generation Iowan and an engineering student at the University of Iowa, and I was raised by 2 women. My biological mom, Terry, told her grandparents that she was pregnant, that the artificial insemination had worked, and they wouldn't even acknowledge it. It actually wasn't until I was born and they succumbed to my infantile cuteness that they broke down and told her that they were thrilled to have another grandson. Unfortunately, neither of them lived to see her marry her partner Jackie of 15 years when they wedded in 2009. My younger sister and only sibling was born in 1994. We actually have the same anonymous donor, so we're full siblings, which is really cool for me. And I guess the point is that our family really isn't so different from any other Iowa family. When I'm home, we go to church together, we eat dinner, we go on vacations. But we have our hard times too, we get in fights. Actually my mom Terry was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2000. It is a devastating disease that put her in a wheelchair, so we've had our struggles. But, we're Iowans. We don't expect anyone to solve our problems for us. We'll fight our own battles. We just hope for equal and fair treatment from our government. Being a student at the University of Iowa, the topic of same-sex marriage comes up quite frequently in classroom discussions. And the question always comes down to, well, can gays even raise kids? And the question, the conversation gets quiet for a moment because most people don't really have an answer. And then I raise my hand and say, actually, I was raised by a gay couple and I'm doing pretty well. I scored in the 99th percentile on the ACT. I'm actually an Eagle Scout. I own and operate my own small business. If I was your son, Mr. Chairman, I believe I'd make you very proud. I'm not really so different from any of your children. My family really isn't so different from yours. After all, your family doesn't derive its sense of worth from being told by the state, you're married, congratulations. No, the sense of family comes from the commitment we make to each other, to work through the hard times so we can enjoy the good ones. It comes from the love that binds us. That's what makes a family. So what you're voting here isn't to change us. It's not to change our families, it's to change how the law views us, how the law treats us. You are voting for the first time in the history of our state to codify discrimination into our Constitution. A Constitution that, but for the proposed amendment, is the least amended Constitution in the United States of America. You are telling Iowans that some among you are second-class citizens who do not have the right to marry the person you love. So will this vote affect my family? Would it affect yours? Over the next 2 hours, I'm sure we're going to hear plenty of testimony about how damaging having gay parents is on kids. But in my 19 years, not once have I ever been confronted by an individual who realized independently that I was raised by a gay couple. And you know why? Because the sexual orientation of my parents has had zero effect on the content of my character. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to try to figure out how to get out of screen sharing here and back to your faces. Hey, so I'm curious, what did you notice about, what were his what strategies was he using to argue for the justice of marriage equality?
This is Deb. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The two things that I noticed was he found common ground between himself and the other people that he was arguing against, and he told a personal story. Those are the two strongest things I saw.
Yeah, exactly. It was very personal, wasn't it? And he was very personable. I mean, adorable, really. And lots of common ground, stories about families that could be true of any and every family. Cool. Anything else you notice?
I'd add one piece, Karen in Cleveland. He also gave his credentials. He was an Eagle Scout. He did well in school. He listed a number of them so that he was seen as a smart, well-adjusted, active, involved person.
Yeah, he had a lot of credentials, right? From his test scores to being a third generation Iowan, right? I mean, that was, he pulled all of that out, which I found really effective and fascinating. And of course, that's something not everyone could do, right? I mean, that's, in some ways, he was using his privilege in a kind of strategic way. But anything else you noticed?
He found common ground, but he also challenged their authentic claim to that common ground.
Right. You're looking for a clean-cut Iowan? Here I am. Yeah, I have taken that from you. Right.
And I heard everything that was mentioned so far. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I heard everything that was mentioned, I heard as well. But then I heard him also reframe the whole argument and taking away conventional, I'll say, norms and playing more to humanity than those conventional norms of love.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's a good point. He's claiming those are kind of transient and flawed, and there's a more common, humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm sorry, was there anyone else who wanted to contribute to that? This is a little different than looking around a classroom. Just a different skill. So I wanted to share that with you because it struck me as completely typical of a fairly Unitarian way of approaching social justice strategy. And what I mean by that is the Unitarian social justice question has usually been, what are the responsible ways to use the powers that we have? So often it becomes an ethical conversation that way, but it's usually something that begins speaking from a place of privilege with the ultimate destination being trying to find ways to share that privilege more broadly. But it is a conversation about sharing power. So he did do all of those things of making it very clear what privileged places he could speak from and was speaking from. And then the other thing that's kind of typically Unitarian about that approach is to argue, once you have that space, to use your power to show that the person or class of persons that's been vilified is just as human as you are in all of the common ways. So to give marriage equality more broadly as the example, I can't think of much as Unitarian Universalists we've done more effectively in the arena of social justice than marriage equality, in the past couple of decades. And almost all of that was trying to find ways to strategically use our power. So for example, we tried to use the power of the church, which gosh knows is a diminishing thing, but the power of the church in terms of granting dignity through commitment ceremonies and civil unions. And for a long time, I don't know if any of you ever got to 25 Beacon Street, our old UUA headquarters, during the days of arguing for marriage equality in Massachusetts. But there was a huge banner right there on the side of 25 Beacon Street, which is next door to the state capitol, arguing for marriage equality. And I always thought that was just such a metaphoric example of, look, we have the house next door to the state capitol. We are using literally our place of privilege to argue for these rights that have been denied to this class of persons. But anyway, that whole kind of setup of that strategy, it's not just 21st century, 20th century. It's been classically what Unitarians have done. So the American Unitarian Association was founded in 1825. And you know what the very first thing our association did? We didn't publish religious education curriculums. We didn't gather the churches together. The very first thing the association did was publish a novel. Can you believe that? We published a novel. And the funny, embarrassing, telling, and adorable thing about that novel is we published a novel that never mentioned Unitarianism. So this novel is called A New England Tale by Catherine Sedgwick, and it's this novel about this really sweet Quaker girl who gets caught in this Connecticut town where she's surrounded by evil Calvinists who believe in original sin, and because of their belief in original sin, behave in just outrageous ways. But so why would our religious association make a novel its first priority? Well, there were lots of novels that followed and lots of pieces of writing that followed. Lydia Marie Child, starts to write her novels and her tracts about African Americans. We find Lydia Marie Child and others of that same era writing novels where the main characters are Native Americans. But it was this very similar strategy of trying to use a place of relatively conventional platform, a novel, a place inside the state legislature, but to use it to kind of allow folks to empathize with folks that they might not actually have in the mix of their real lives. So anyway, I see that strategy kind of running through our Unitarian past. Emphasis on the common humanity and trying to find a conventional platform for telling that story. I'm going to just pause there and see if there's anything, any other examples you can think of where we've made those kind of moves, or if you have any questions about what I've said. Yeah, and I know we don't have time to do the topic justice here, but when you think about the transition that we had as the Unitarian Universalist Association from moving from an era of civil rights to Black empowerment, this would be one way of explaining the difficulty of that transition. That when we were asked by Martin Luther King to go ahead and lend some of our privilege by walking with people in Selma, that was something that we knew how to do and something that fit inside of this theological ethics that we already had formed. But the question of how to give power and how to empower was a slightly different one that we were not entirely prepared for. Anyway, that's something to bracket, because there's no way we could do justice to the civil rights. But that's just to say, I think the classic Unitarian question is this: what is the responsible use of the power we have? And of course, the fact of the matter is most of us are really complicated blends of having some powers and privileges and not having other powers and privileges. Which is why I'm glad we have two sides to our family, because the classic Universalist question was a slightly different one. The Universalist question around social action was, how do you get the power you don't have? How can you empower yourselves and empower others? And I'm sure you can see how that's, not entirely unrelated, but yet a different kind of question than how to share or use power responsibly. So I'd like to go ahead now and just show you my example of how I think that works. So what I'm going to show you is Elizabeth Mout, who I was telling you about. Is one of the people who hung off the bridge in the Greenpeace action. And Elizabeth is also a Unitarian Universalist seminarian. And so Greenpeace interviewed them about why they did what they did. And just listen to how she frames it. It's both very beautiful and I think very indicative of our histories. Pulling up our video. Okay.
This is a personal fight for me because of my faith. I'm actually a Unitarian Universalist seminarian, and we come to our faith from a position that all people are inherently worthy, all souls are sacred. Every person who is affected by global warming and by rising sea levels, by melting oceans, is worth fighting for. I want Shell to know that human lives are more important than profits, that the Arctic itself is more important. Whether or not this action stops them permanently, there's going to be more coming.
Okay, I'm going to try to get out of that. Let's see if we can get back to screen sharing. Eek! We're caught. Okay. And there we are again. So what did you notice about how Elizabeth couched their approach to explaining the justice action?
This is Deb. The main thing I noticed was that the idea that understanding that the action she's taking may or may not solve the issue, but it will move it forward. Which is something that I think we all struggle with doing social justice, because you're like, can I fix it now? And and it's a long haul. So understanding that and being able to then, still go through with your actions and continue.
Yeah, I think that's really key. some of you may know the work of Sharon Welch. She's one of our Unitarian ethicists. She has a fabulous book called The Feminist Ethic of Risk. But she argues very persuasively that inside of the Unitarian culture, there's this kind of middle class assumption that the way you solve problems is imagine your end point and then like project manage your way to the end. And her point is that, especially when you're talking about environmental issues, it's not going to work like that. First of all, how can you imagine the end point? And it's not as easy as, you can't just easily task your way to that completion. But she also very persuasively says that that's a kind of shadow side of having a place of privilege, that you forget there's a great deal of value of just getting in the mix and messing some stuff up and seeing what new possibilities might emerge from that mess, even if you cannot perfectly envision the end. So anyway, Deb, I just love that you made that point, because the Universalists really didn't suffer from that particular shortcoming. They were much more ready to get into the mix and just see what could be done. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in many ways they were not as empowered as the Unitarians were. So their approach to the action issues had to be a little bit different. And some of the ways they got in and messed things up were just absolutely glorious. Can I tell you a temperance story? I'm sorry, I like to gossip about like the 19th century. So one of the ways that the Universalist women who are interested in temperance got saloons to close down, and just a little, sidebar here, temperance, of course, in the 19th century was a feminist movement. Now we think of it as being kind of a Puritan thing, but it was thoroughly a feminist movement. It was about women having access to their own financial independence, and it was about women not being a victim of domestic abuse. But anyway, the way that they got to close down saloons is they would walk into saloons and very politely ask the saloon owners if they might pray. And like the saloon owners were like so freaked out because here's some like, church ladies asking you if they can pray in your space. They were just conditioned to say yes. And so they just, got in that space and messed with it. I love that. They didn't have a really clear out, how is this going to work? What's the next step? What's our end game? They were just going to mess with it, and they were going to just trying to start claiming that space, just like the Greenpeace activists, literally claimed the space of that seaport entry into Portland. But I'm rambling on under the guise of asking you what you saw in that statement.
I don't know whether this is relevant, but what really struck me was that she was not the star. The visuals from loops of rope to thingamajiggies and clamps, that took up a lot more space and time, and I'm not quite sure why.
Oh, interesting. That's a good question. Yeah, I like very much that Elizabeth wasn't the personal star, right? Because I think sometimes we get in trouble with our social action stories by, thinking that our justice depends on just a few heroic individuals instead of entire groups. But I hadn't thought about how indeed the camera angle is about this very physical reality of what they were doing. Interesting. Anything else you notice? Yeah, Tim.
Well, I was just thinking that it goes back to that old analogy of the heart and the head, and the Universalists being the heart of the movement, the Unitarians being the intellectuals of the movement, and the heart goes ahead and acts out of passion, and that's the Universalist approach.
Yeah, I usually, kind of resist, resist that just because there are some complexities there. Like for a while in the 19th century, the Unitarians were gossiping about the Universalists and saying that the Universalists were too geeky and, that they were too in their heads and they really needed to get out of their books. And for a while, the Universalists were gossiping about the Unitarians, that they were too into this sappy, sentimental stuff. So, I mean, there's some complexity there. But yeah, in terms of how this plays out, the way that Elizabeth so easily claims a faith position, really stands out as being a piece of that tradition. Elizabeth said just right up front, my faith tradition says this. Strikes me as a very sort of universalist empowerment kind of way of approaching it. Anything else? So the only other thing I wanted to mention that I noticed in that, did you notice how she expanded the circle of what she cares about? It kind of starts a little bit small, and then the next circle is what we care about. We care about, what did she say? We care about the Antarctic itself. And then she says, and we care about all of the people who are going to be affected by climate change. And we care, and that circle just keeps being drawn wider and wider. That is such a classic universalist social justice strategy. So I can't resist. This is the only 19th century poem I'll read tonight. But this is Edwin Markham, and I bet you know it. This is this classic universalist sentiment. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and I took him in. You'll probably remember when there was that horrible shooting in Tennessee inside of the Unitarian Universalist Church, that the response of the UU community there was to say that their love encompasses even the person who had done this thing. Again, that's just a classic universalist theological move, is to just keep that circle going wider and wider. So there are a lot of benefits to that. The only kind of shadow side to that is that the Universalists were just so confused if there was ever anybody who didn't want to be included in that embrace, right? They just didn't get that piece. But the strategy for their empowerment was this ever-widening circle of theological worth. Okay, so I know that time is clicking along, so I think we should probably talk about our 3 theologies. But if there's anything hanging out there about strategies that we haven't done, we could certainly take the time. One of the challenges of teaching on Zoom is I can't do directed and threatening eye contact. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about our theologies. So I'm going to name 3 theologies that I think are really important in informing our social justice work, and I doubt any of them will surprise you very much. First of all, there's interdependence. Second, I want to talk about eminence, which is a big, fat theological word, but really it's about the understanding that the divine is present in this world and not just something that's out there beyond our reach. And then finally, I want to talk about different forms of religious existentialism, which is just, again, a big, fat theological word for taking the matter and the nitty-gritty of this life incredibly seriously. So let me just kind of do those one at a time. So interdependence, so I think we all know interdependence is important, right? We've all learned to talk about the principles and the purposes, and we've all learned to talk about that we respect the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. And of course, I think it's clearly understood what that has to do in terms of our relationship and participation in the natural world, that this is almost a biological imperative, that it is a description of our very existence, that we are interdependent. But I think we could probably do better knowing what our Unitarian and Universalist theologians have said about how that interdependence works socially. So let me just tell you a story. I think the greatest theologian in recent times of the interdependence is a fairly obscure guy named Bernard Loomer, who towards the end of his life was a member of our church in Berkeley. He had taught at the Graduate Theological Union before then. And he had a really interesting twofold way of seeing interdependence. On one hand, he saw it as a natural thing, and so he was fond of saying, if you pluck a flower, you disturb a star. You know, again, talking about that as kind of a condition of nature, that we are so attached to each other and all of the entities of creation. But he also talked about social interdependence. And he said he thought that everything that Jesus said in the Bible, when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, that actually when he was talking about the kingdom of heaven, he meant the interdependent web. Ooh, so wrap your mind around that. Isn't that fun? So just to give an example of how that works, Loomer used to love to kind of retell the story of the loaves and the fishes. So, you know, the gospel story where Jesus is trying to get out of town because he's sick of people. We forget those parts of the New Testament, right? There's quite a few where Jesus is actually trying to escape because he's tired of all the stuff. So anyway, Jesus is trying to get out of town because he's tired of all the stuff. And he ends up, you know, teaching, and this great crowd gathers. And he spent all day teaching, and at the end of the day, you know, he's realizing he's got several thousand people to feed with a small amount of food. So, you know, the classic kind of way of understanding that story is the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, that there was some kind of miracle, that, you know, Jesus created there to be enough fish and bread to feed this huge crowd. Well, Bernard Loomer tells that story a little differently. And in his version of the story, he said that actually, when you think about it, most of the people who showed up to hear Jesus' teaching probably had provisions on them, you know? So they've got food stuffed about themselves. They've got food in their overcoats, right? Sorry, I'm being anachronistic just for fun. You know, they've got stuff on them, but they're keeping it to themselves until after the whole day of hearing Jesus talk about interdependence. When the call comes around and the basket starts to go through the crowd, so Loomer is imagining that just as many people are contributing food to the basket as are taking out of it, because they've now grasped this principle of social interdependence. So I might have been a little too enthusiastic for that, you know, slightly odd retelling of this story, but I think you can see what he means. So he was always saying our goal as spiritual beings is that we need to grow our soul bigger. You know, and he uses the metaphor of size a lot. It needs to be bigger. And the bigger it is, the more it encompasses. And the more it encompasses, it becomes impossible to think about scarcity. It becomes impossible to think about hoarding. Instead, you just have this picture of an interdependence that isn't just natural, but is also social and also spiritual. So I mentioned him as a contemporary voice, but really this idea goes way further back, and I think it's so important for social activists. Clarence Skinner was an early 20th century Universalist theologian who said the most beautiful thing about why it is we all have to do social action. He said, so that when you are inside of a society that's inequitable, some people will experience that inequity as privilege and as power. Some people will experience that inequity in the forms of direct oppression. And he says, what you have to be careful about is the folks who experience that inequity as power and privilege are going to feel a spiritual alienation, the cause of which they will not understand. So his thinking was this classic universalist idea that we're all intertwined, we're all connected, that actually, you know, we were intended to be completely equal. And so we have this society that makes us unequal. Some of us will suffer that as direct oppression, but the rest of us will just suffer that as a spiritual alienation. I think that's really important because, you know, to do social justice work in a sustainable way, you really need some kind of personal theology about why you have no choice, right? You know, it can't really be something you pick up and you put down. So I think these theologies of interdependence, you know, are just vital for understanding why you have no choice. Right, so I'm getting a, right in the chat, right, so the spiritual alienation quote is from Clarence Skinner. And Joan, we have access to folks' email, right? I could send that around for people tomorrow, maybe, if you wanted to look at that for yourselves. And, you know, that was always the universalist point of view, is that, you know, you can't be happy as long as one person is unhappy. And of course, by happiness, they didn't mean, you know, trivial happiness, but, you know, deep soul satisfaction is impossible as long as that exists. So that's interdependence. Anything you want to add or talk about regarding interdependence? Have you seen that showing up in our social justice worlds?
Yes. I mean, at its core, it's what we talk about. So as a Black person, I've often been ashamed or afraid to talk to white people about privilege, you know, because living in this society, I've learned to actually protect a lot of my white brothers and sisters. But what I've grown to realize and understand is that I'm depriving them of a full life experience by not revealing the presence of privilege and what that's taking away from them. And that's just what we said about Skinner is touching on that. It's really not a gift. It's depriving them of a full and a whole life experience.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Yeah, and that's, you know, obviously the most sustainable and kind of holistic way to think about anti-oppression work, is that why it might seem like people of privilege have, well, they do have obvious examples.
Yeah.
There's still a spiritual cost that gets wrapped up in that, and a human cost.
Yes.
Cool. Anything else we want to say about interdependence? We're just breezing through all of you theology. I love it. Moving right along. So the second, oh, sorry, Joan.
This is Lori Albright, and I'm sorry I joined late.
Oh, no worries.
But what's coming to my mind is in terms of looking at society and how we're so strung out economically and socially and stratified and all that sort of thing, I feel that oftentimes, particularly my white brothers and sisters, often it looks to me like they kind of live in bubbles of people that are sort of on the same plane as they are. And I imagine, you know, sort of the further up bubbles that are there are even more isolated and insulated. And it just strikes me as, people have the sense of angst and discomfort in the sense of, but I don't know what to do. I don't know what I can do and all that sort of thing. And so when there are some members of our congregation who are involved in social justice work, I think the people in the congregation feel really good and proud about that, but they still feel conflicted and don't feel quite energized enough to or maybe they're afraid to engage in that directly themselves. It's an interesting, I think the interdependence thing, there is this yearning and yet fear, yearning and fear back and forth is what I perceive.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yearning and fear, that's a good way to describe it. A yearning for something more whole.
Yes.
But on the other hand, if that gives up knowing, the life you've known, that's very complicated.
I can share a couple of my favorite Margaret Wheatley quotes. Now, Margaret Wheatley, coming, of course, from the Buddhist perspective, but I find it incredibly compatible. Of course, she says there's no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Because she says relationships are all there is. And that...
Sorry, that's me who didn't mute my phone. It's the landline. Who knew the landline still worked? I had no idea.
Those are so archaic anymore. But she says relationships are all there is, and everything in the universe only exists because it's in relationship to everything else. And this comes out of her new book on the new science. At the core, everything is not substance, but relationship. She says nothing exists in isolation. And one of our core duties is to realize and stop pretending that we're individuals who can go it alone. And it's a matter of pretense, not a matter of fact.
Beautifully put. And I'm trying to think, oh gosh, someone will know the name of this. There's this curriculum that came out a couple of years ago, meant to help people understand the culture of poverty more. Oh, I'm not giving you enough details, but it had this fascinating exercise, which asked you to imagine from inside a couple different class perspectives what your priorities are when you go out to your car in the morning and your car's not working. But the bottom line of this was to show that people with class privilege have kind of taken what used to be human relationships and substituted that with a relationship to the capitalist economy, right? So the person of class privilege makes getting to work their priority, and the person of class privilege fixes their car by paying money for it, as opposed to someone from a different class perspective who would be late to work in order to, maintain human relationships that help you with these things. Anyway, it's just, it's fascinating to think how we could actually be different. So let me just move on to the second theological concept. And of course, it won't be a problem if we discover these concepts to be interrelated. We would like that, actually. But the second concept I wanted to talk about was radical immanence. And immanence, again, is just this notion that, whatever it is you find to be divine and holy really is in this life, and not simply transcendent on another sphere. So the person I chose to illustrate this, who's a contemporary thinker, is Charles Hartshorne. And he wrote a book he aimed at lay people called Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, because he was talking about how it's really kind of a mistake in Christian theology if you just imagine that God is some sort of perfect, unchanging thing. That is really more a concept that comes from Greek philosophy. God is an ideal, and what are ideals? Ideals are things that just never ever alter. But he said actually, and he's a part of what some of you I'm sure know of as the process theology movement, saying that it's really much more intrinsically Christian and humane to imagine that God is an evolutionary concept, that God is changing, that it matters to God how we are, and God changes in relationship to that, but that the whole process of creation itself is unfolding. So that's really abstract, but I can tell you my favorite story about Charles Hartshorne, the human being, that I think illustrates how this works. I just think this is so adorable. So after he'd had a really distinguished career as an academic theologian, he went back to school to study biology. And specifically, he went back to school to study birds and birdsong because he became completely obsessed with the question of whether or not when birds sing, are they making music? You know, so in other words, he believed that when birds sing, they're actually creating something. They're not just doing something instinctual or something rote. And the reason that mattered to him so much, that he wanted to, you know, get the science to prove this point, was for him, God was the ultimate example of life interested in other life. And so that life is interested in life, and life being interested in life creates in this cycle of mutuality. So if the bird is creating, you know, the bird in some sense is not just singing back to its creator, but all of this life is in the process of this unfolding creativity that includes all of us, humans and animals and plants and rocks and, you know, things that we can't even imagine. So that's kind of a contemporary example, but, you know, we have an older example of this in all of our, you know, beloved transcendentalists who saw intrinsic and holy things, you know, unfolding in the natural world. And that, of course, becomes incredibly important to ecological justice, but it's not incidentally related to social justice, right? Because it makes the point very beautifully that, you know, inherent worth and dignity, you know, is everywhere and in everything. Everything is part and parcel of God, and therefore nothing inside of that should be maligned. So what do you think? Do birds make music? I don't know enough biology to know if I think that's scientifically true, but I know I'm completely enamored of the theology of that.
And so again, was he saying that life becomes life and elongated as we become fascinated with life?
Well, he said, so God is the ultimate example of life interested in life.
Right.
So we as humans have some capacity to be life interested in life,
right.
You know, when we show interest in each other, and even when we show interest in our personal development, and when we show interest in the life of the planet or the life of creatures. So we have a capacity to be life interested in life. And
right.
The bird has a capacity to be life interested in life, insofar as the bird is actually contributing to this creativity and in some senses, you know, enjoying
right.
life. But so for him, God is the ultimate example of life interested in life. God is kind of this container for life being interested in life.
Right.
So the mutual creativity of all of this is the ultimate unfolding of the divine. So this becomes an argument, you know, again, the arguments about why nature is sacred are really easy there. But the arguments for different kinds of social injustices are, you know, when you suppress someone's innate capacities, that's a sin, not just, you know, not just against an individual, but, you know, it's this violation of this unfolding creative ongoing process, which isn't just a reflection of the divine, but is the divine.
Powerful.
Yes. Can you say that again?
Sure, and I promise I will send you my crib notes tomorrow too. I have a kind of crude outline I could send you that would work for notes. But right, so life, God is life interested in life. So we as human beings want to maximize our personal ability to be life interested in life. And we also want to be really attentive to the places where life is not given the opportunity to unfold in the way that that God, life interested in life, would like. Not because God is an anthropomorphic character that likes things, but because we're all mutually involved in this creative process.
Right. So when we suppress anybody we define as an other, we are therefore suppressing all the unfolding of the universe and life.
Right, you are against life. You are literally choosing against life. You are life disinterested in life. You are life, actually impairing the creative unfolding.
Right.
Which goes back to the interdependence.
Right.
Yes. Can't get away from it.
Right, exactly. Right. It's hard to. Okay, let me just hold up one last theological point, because I notice we're almost on 8 o'clock. And that is just that our social action has always been, had a very heavy flavor of religious existentialism to it. And what I mean by that is there's been a deep reluctance to write off any actual human suffering and just describe it as a theological process. So I'll give you an example. Anthony Penn is my current favorite living UU theologian. Wonderful. He's a professor at Rice University. His specialty is African American humanism, and he gives, you can Google him online real easily. He's got some great YouTube videos up there talking about his own life experience, because he talks about how he grew up in a very conservative Methodist church, and indeed he was identified early as a child preacher and someone destined for the ministry. And he had all those gifts, but it was ultimately the problem of suffering that caused him to turn away from that theology and become a humanist. And for him, it was explicitly about racism and suffering. And this line of thought goes back also to William R. Jones, who was a Unitarian minister who wrote a book called Is God a White Racist? And what this is about is, so what Penn and Jones said is, so why would God allow the tremendous suffering that came with slavery and comes with enduring racism to exist? To protect God, you need to be able to make some kind of argument that that suffering was redemptive, that that suffering actually had an ultimate purpose. And what Jones and Penn say is, if you do that, you've just made God into a racist, because you've made God into an entity that is not completely committed to the complete empowerment of all people. Penn talks about he became a humanist because he decided he was never going to throw people under the bus in order to save a concept about God. But the way I think it becomes kind of more broadly disseminated in Unitarian Universalism, and even older than Penn, and even older than humanism, is in this idea that you take human suffering with primary seriousness, and you do not write yourself a theological supposition that makes that suffering secondary. So Hosea Ballou, the early 19th century Universalist theologian, had an almost similar idea of suffering, although Hosea Ballou did it as a very capital T theist, because he said, you don't want to say that Jesus suffered for our sins, because then you've just made suffering redemptive. And so he said, what you need to say is that, Jesus taught us how to be in this world, but that the second you say suffering is redemptive, you have just given an alibi to all kinds of human oppressions. So anyway, just to review then, we've got our kind of three theologies of the interdependence, the immanence, and then religious existentialism. It's just a fancy word, but I think I'm just trying to name that Unitarian Universalist instinct of saying we're not, the suffering is the primary testimony. The suffering is not, that needs to be taken with great seriousness. So, wow, is it 8:01? Oh man, shoot. I thought I had a lot less. Well, that's okay. I know I know we were, Joan, I think you're muted. I know we are due to stop at 8, but I'm happy to.
We have till 8:30. The idea
marvelous.
That there be time for discussion, but we've been doing discussion during. So we're fine.
Oh, fabulous. I was thinking I was already keeping you late, and I hate keeping folk late. Great. Well, then let's take some time if there's anything we want to say about these last two concepts, and then we can talk just a little bit about what a UU approach to interfaith work is. So I kind of ran through that last piece.
I really only have two of the theologies. What's the third one?
So the first is the interdependence.
Right.
And we talked about Bernard Loomer and Clarence Skinner there. The second is our radical immanence.
Right.
Immanence being the holy in the matter and the details and the existence of the everyday. And we talked about Charles Hartshorne there. He's the guy who had to go figure out what the bird song was all about. He did write his master's thesis on arguing that birdsong is music. And then the final category that I rushed through too quickly because I was sure we were out of time was this concept of religious existentialism, which I associated with Anthony Penn, just as an example.
I missed the word existentialism.
Yeah, and just existentialism in the sense that it just refuses to make, the facts of human life anything other than ultimately important. Something that Anthony Penn talks a lot about is the nitty-gritty. He says, the nitty-gritty, those places in our lives where we realize we have discomfort and personal experiences that aren't quite gelling. He says those are the things you don't write off. Those are the things that you pay the most attention to. So again, it's this kind of commitment to make sure that you don't ever say that human oppression is an acceptable consequence of some other process.
Is religious existentialism more compatible with Unitarian thought or with Universalist thought?
Oh, I think it's very compatible with either, because I was kind of surprised in my own thinking that when I was trying to think of an older example of what Anthony Penn is doing, that I immediately thought of Hosea Ballou, Universalist. But Hosea Ballou was really, and Universalism was all about this, questioning what the doctrine of atonement meant. And so for a Calvinist in the 19th century, the doctrine of atonement meant that, the gap between God and humanity was so broken that God himself had to fill it in by suffering on the cross as Jesus. This is the notion that Jesus' suffering, paid our debts. Ballou looked at that and was completely convinced that as soon as you say that, you justify suffering. And so he was very insistent on saying, and he was also worried that that's a kind of strange, that's not a very universalist God. That's not a big God of love. So he said it's actually that sense of estrangement we feel from God. It's not really that we've sinned so bad that there's this broken relationship between humanity and God. That actually God has always been there with us. It's just from time to time as human beings we forget that. So it's not that God has to be reconciled to us because we've messed up so badly. It's just that we have to remember that God's there. So that's a very Christian theistic way, but of talking about a similar dynamic, but I'm sure you can see the similarity to the pen in the sense of not wanting to say that there's some holy purpose to suffering. There are a lot of feminist theologians who make the same argument and talk about how, for example, I can give you a very explicit example. Linda Mercandante, who teaches theology at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where I am, she wrote a very beautiful book on suffering and kind of 12-step programs. But she talks about how when she was the victim of domestic violence and she sought help from fairly conventional Christian ministers, she was told that her suffering served a purpose. Her suffering made her more like Jesus. And she was completely freaked out because, of course, what she needed to hear was that, this was a wrong, and she needed to be empowered, not to be told that her disempowerment was actually, something that made her more like the holy example. But that's the same dynamic that Penn was concerned about. That if you imagine a God says that slavery was justified because the people were strong enough to bear it, or slavery was just, whatever you say around that, you've already committed a theological sin. To not take that primary fact of human suffering as the first and the last and most important testimony.
There's this whole thing about suffering, and I think about with liberation theology. And one of the ways that liberation theology would have problem with a universalism or a universal salvation concept is that where is justice if everybody gets reconciled with God, the people who suffer and the people who oppress? And where is that, where's the function of the liberation then? And what are the consequences for forcing suffering on other people if suffering doesn't have a redemptive quality to it?
So yeah, the liberation theology example is interesting. I can kind of channel a universalist response to that, which is to say that the universalists didn't feel that sin was without consequence, and that acts of injustice were without consequence. They just thought the consequences in this world were pretty hideous enough to bear. And that for them, the consequences, more than anything, would be that sense of spiritual alienation. So that once you've, stepped on a wrong course, whether or not the police catch up with you, or some kind of cosmic sense of justice is enacted, you're already suffering that in your own being, that separation.
Okay. Yeah.
But the piece of liberation theology that's super consistent with this is, the liberation theology folks say that the place of privileged listening always has to be to the person who has suffered the injustice. The right to say what's going on, the right to interpret what's going on, is given to the person in the oppressed place. And I think that's super consistent with this point of view.
That's a good clarification. Yeah. And I just remember hearing James Cone say that would be one of his problems with universalism.
Yeah.
And that, that there is no justice at the end because I have to endure them in the eternal.
Yeah, people had a lot of problems with universalism with that historically. I mean, did you know for a while universalists couldn't even serve on juries because people figured that our sense of moral compass was just totally off. That what was the point of doing anything right if there were going to be no ultimate eternal consequences for that? Wow, that just shows you the vast difference between a universalist understanding of what motivates us and a non-universalist understanding of what motivates us. Can we appeal to the higher angels of our nature? And don't people do better when you do that than to just simply threaten people with consequences?
There's still a concept of accountability, even if there is not a hell.
Absolutely.
In that particular, focused definition.
Totally. You're not getting away with anything. Okay. Is there anything? Oh, sure. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was going to say, were you going to say something about interfaith work?
I was just going to move on to that if we
Great.
were wrapping up the theology section. So, right. So we are in a magical age, right, where it looks like the future of all of our social justice efforts in so many ways hinge on our ability to do interfaith work. And the cool thing is, I do think as Unitarian Universalists, we've got some really awesome and natural strengths in that area. So one of them, if we just kind of, go down the theological concepts we talked about, the obvious one that occurs to me is to think about the interdependence. Something that can hang folks up on interfaith work, and Ibu Patel has been really good talking about this, is that, sometimes folks think we shouldn't align on social justice different issues with folks that we have other serious disagreements with. Can you work with the church down the street who's where you are about poverty if they're not where you are about gay rights? All these kind of questions that often come up in interfaith work. I think if you go for a strict interdependent kind of answer to that, you realize that not only can we be in relationship with people who don't believe exactly as we do, we already are in relationship with people who don't believe exactly as we do. And so that, forming those kind of interfaith partnerships are just absolutely vital in terms of showing and demonstrating just our capacity to be in good relationship without always having to have the content of our thoughts be absolutely identical. And then, of course, the other great thing is we do have this, very, very long history of interfaith relationships as a way of understanding who we are. So this is some of the work I've done historically on our roots in Europe. It's just so fascinating to me that when Unitarians emerged in Eastern Europe and in Transylvania, they're like, oh gosh, well, this is really interesting. We're emerging in this way, in this context that is, deeply Muslim. We should be in conversation with the Muslims about this. And then when Unitarianism was emerging in Poland, they're like, well, this is interesting. We're talking about Jesus, but Jesus as not necessarily a divine entity. Does that make us the same or different than Jews? And how does it make it the same or different as Jews? And they talk to their Jewish neighbors about that question. I think this, the mixity, if there's any religious tradition in the world that is open to the mixity of the interfaith world, I think it would have to be ours. But yet, we've allowed that assumption that we should have ideological agreement across the board, perhaps, to get into the way of that. but I did a terrible job of summarizing 2,000 years of history in a few sentences. What more should we say about interfaith and Unitarian Universalists? Did you know that in the 19th century, the Unitarians and Reformed Jews were talking seriously about merging? It was fascinating. I mean, people really thought it was going to happen. So the Unitarians were saying, oh gosh, you know, we're in exactly the same theological place you guys are. Isn't that cool? And the Reformed Jews were like, yeah, we're in the same theological place that you are. Isn't that great? And then so it became time to actually talk about, you know, more practical details of what that would look like. And it turned out that both sides were assuming that the other would come into its, you know, right? You know what I'm saying? So like the Reformed Jews were just assuming that all the Unitarians would become Reformed Jews. And the Unitarians were just assuming that all the Unitarians would become, I'm sorry, you know what I mean. Everybody was just, but anyway, I just love that story because, you know, cultural difference actually does exist. So even when we agree on certain things, you know, the relationships can still be quite distinctive.
Our church in Cincinnati at First Unitarian had pulpit exchanges with Isaac Wise, who was the founder of Judaism. And one of the issues that ended up causing a division was that the Reformed Jews would not take an abolitionist point of view because they were not feeling that they were secure enough or safe enough in American society that they could go out on the limb and oppose slavery. So they became part of the Democratic Party in supporting slavery.
Oh, wow, that's so interesting. I forgot that those conversations happened in your neighborhood, Tim. Wow. Cincinnati is the source of much rich Unitarian history. Very cool.
This is Deb. I just wanted to comment that the concept of you don't have to be completely on board with everything in order to be in a relationship with someone is something that I have found has come in very handy in speaking and trying to include family and friends that didn't necessarily vote the same direction that I did. And a lot of those conversations are really hard. And that's the only way to be able to continue some relationships. Some I'm just not going to continue, but the ones that I want to or I want to be able to, that's the only way to do that, is to find what it is that you can be in relationship about, and those other things, it's okay that they're not the same. So
yeah, what horrible divides we've seen, you know, in the past year and so. Although it does remind me, I think something a lot of folks don't know about Unitarian history is the fact that we're relatively politically in agreement is kind of a brand new thing. You know, it's really only post-late 60s, post-Vietnam War. My own father was a very politically conservative Unitarian. So, you know, raised me to be a Unitarian Universalist, but, you know, during the Vietnam War was definitely a hawk and, you know, politically and socially conservative in all other ways. It's kind of a new thing that, you know, and I don't think it's just a new thing for Unitarian Universalists. I think it's a new thing that, you know, we live lives that are mainly with people who are in agreement with us.
The only other comment I would make on that is I came to this call straight from rehearsal for 1984. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on in my head after that. So it's very timely.
Sociologists have now found that it used to be that our political views were to some extent shaped by our faith community. You know, we would listen to sermons. It might actually change the way we think, you know, and talk with others about ethical commitments, etc. But in the last decade or so, we have chosen our religions based on our politics. Complete reversal of that. And that is one of those little fascinating things that sociologists are now trying to come to some understanding on.
Yeah, that's so complicated. Is there a public square anymore? Or are we all just in these self-selected bubbles, which Google and Facebook enhance for us?
This is Lori talking again. In at First Unitarian in Cleveland, last year we celebrated our 150th anniversary, and we had a number of guest speakers. One of whom was Peter Lawson Jones, and he was a former county commissioner, and he's just kind of a Renaissance man. But anyway, he proposed that in terms of social identity, because of the changes that occur now in our culture, you might switch careers, you don't belong. You know, it used to be everybody belonged to some kind of religious organization, whether you actually believed in it or not. Most people don't belong to that anymore. Many of the social clubs, you know, the Lions Club and that kind of stuff, everybody's like, you know, dying on the vine. His supposition was the only enduring identity anymore are sports teams.
Oh my God.
And I first laughed when I heard that, but the more I thought about it, you know, I think he's really onto something there. And that, I'm not sure what that means, but I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Did he have a theory about why sports teams would feel like an identity? You can tell I'm a sports illiterate asking that question.
Well, it's a whole cultural phenomenon. My son is a huge sports fan, and people can spend their entire time off of work.
Oops.
Oh dear.
Kind of breaking in and out, Lori.
Now it's like, hey, how about those Indians? Okay. Well, I think I'm done saying what I needed to say.
Yeah, good question. Terrifying.
Yeah.
We are coming up on the 5-minute mark. So if there are any final questions or comments or things that folk would like to have clarified, now would be a good time to bring them forth.
Yeah, or just anything we didn't get to that you were hoping we might. We got time for that.
Yep.
I guess, again, this is Lori. I guess I would just say that to affirm the comments that were made earlier about interdependence. And to me, anytime you want to get organizing done and do something, you need to have a big tent. So if you spend your time arguing about issues that aren't related to the action you're trying to do, it's distracting from the energy and isn't going to help you accomplish your goal. Being involved in the protest community in Cleveland, it's been interesting to watch so many attempts people have made to try to have organizing meetings, and people will want to talk about their pet issues that are unrelated to the task at hand. And they'll talk about herding cats. Woo! But I think if we could all agree that when we have a common interest, that we could stick to that and come together around that, and that's a good thing. We don't have to agree on everything, that we could get a lot more done.
Amen to that. And that it's perfectly okay if those interests are transitory, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We can have partnerships that aren't eternal.
Yep.
And that's a great segue or introduction to what we're going to be talking about next month, is how we're able to bring our energies together in our congregations to start with. Yeah.
I had to get a couch so you can sit next to me.
Well, I just want to say thank you for doing this, and I'm looking forward to the next one, and I really appreciate the time you put into it. Both of you, all of you.
Yeah, you're most welcome, and I appreciate all of you taking time out of your evening.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Susan, for a wonderful discussion and some great little videos. It was good to see, especially Elizabeth. I knew her out in Denver. So thank you all for being here. And we will be recording this and putting it on our YouTube channel once I figure out how to do a YouTube channel, which I will do, by the way. And then the whole series will be recorded. So don't be too upset if you have to miss one or the other for some reason. But thank you for being here. Thank you, Susan. This is absolutely great. Good kickoff.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.